Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Basement Files. I'm Ginger, and I'm super happy to have you here and to tell you about the case that I have for you today. This case is about Betty Neumar. She was labeled the Black Widow Granny because she was married 5 times and all 5 husbands came up dead. So, what really interested me in this case is not just the fact that she was born in my hometown of Ironton, Ohio, but also because I had heard about it throughout the years. I knew there'd been some documentaries on it. I saw a newspaper article on the case about 15, 16 years ago, and I'm glad I took this deep dive because there are so many details that I dug up that I did not know before, and they are things that just blew my mind. So I'm about ready to blow your mind with all of these details. But before I get into that, I want to go over a little something here, and that's if you are listening on an audio platform like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you will be able to hear the videos that I integrated into the episode. Otherwise, you can go to YouTube and you can watch them, and you can also see the photos that I put throughout. Otherwise, just sit back, relax, and take a listen, and I hope that you enjoy this episode. So, let's get started. So Betty Neumar was born on November 27th, 1931, and as I mentioned before, she was born in Ironton, Ohio. Ironton is a small town, less than 11,000 residents right now. There were more residents in the city, I believe, in the 1930s. It was when her 4th husband was murdered in 1986 that she ended up charged with arranging his murder. And that is what prompted the investigation into the deaths of her other husbands. But what I want to do first, before we really dig into the nitty-gritty of it, is to tell you some about her life. Betty's father was a coal miner. They relocated to Florida when he began working on the railroads. There is not a lot of information on Betty's childhood. However, the fact that her dad was a coal miner turned railroad worker gives an idea of what their economic standing was. My guess is that they left Ironton in the 1930s or early 1940s. In those decades, coal miners weren't high earners. Their wages depended on how much they mined, the level of danger involved in their position, and the area labor unions. Railroad workers had a wider range of pay available to them because there were so many more roles that they could get into. So Betty's father might or might not have made a more comfortable wage. However, there had to be something worth it because he took his family from Ironton to Florida, and that is about a 1,000-mile move. That is a hard move to make, so there had to be something that was worth it. But working conditions, no matter what kind of labor industry you were in, they were always difficult. The labor struggles were real. In the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of strikes happening for better wages and better working conditions. And when strikes were happening, workers weren't always getting to work. And if they weren't working, they weren't getting paid. So I would say that there were still some significant struggles for them because they did eventually make their way back to the Ironton area sometime before Betty graduated high school, because she graduated from South Point High School, which is about 6 or 7 miles away from Ironton. Then when she graduated in 1950, she, right out of the gate, married Clarence Malone, and that wedding took place in Ironton, Ohio. But sadly, they had a pretty rough relationship, and they divorced in 1952, which is the same year that their son was born. But 18 years later, Clarence was murdered. He was shot dead. And the investigation into that murder, the 2008 investigation started because she was charged in North Carolina with the solicitation of murder of her 4th husband, Harold Gentry. This prompted Ohio authorities to say, hey, we need to take another look at the death of Clarence Malone. And as far as the details of Clarence's murder, he was shot one time in the back of the head outside of his Medina, Ohio body shop. Now, Medina is about 35 miles outside of Cleveland, give or take. However, again, this was 18 years after he was married to Betty. So Why would she want him dead? Clarence's brother, Robert Malone, was really surprised when authorities reopened the case and her name was mentioned. He had not heard her name for years. Once she and Clarence broke up, she just disappeared, and the fact that she was a suspect was just shocking. The reason why she and Clarence had divorced was she had filed a complaint saying that he had been abusing her. It's not entirely clear what the result of that complaint was, and it's not even clear exactly when they broke up, because nobody really knows where to look. Anyway, Roger, Clarence's brother Roger, described the relationship between Clarence and Betty as rough. He said she was the type of person that if you raised your hand, she'd jump on you and you'd get in trouble. She was demanding. Clarence was just starting out in life. He was driving a coal truck, but Robert said that just was not good enough for Betty. And as far as their son Gary, after the divorce, the Malone family never got to see the boy. It just broke Clarence's mother's heart because she didn't get to know her grandson. So Clarence ended up going off and joining the army, and he served in Korea. When he came back from the war, he opened the body shop where he would eventually be killed. He had also remarried 2 times. Another brother, Donald Malone, had continued pushing police to keep looking for Clarence's killer up until Donald died. He never got to see any kind of justice for his brother. But Robert said the case had just faded away, and that's why Donald was putting so much energy into it. He wanted them to find who murdered his brother, but the authorities just let it fade away as if they didn't care at all about what happened to Clarence. And what's even crazier is that one of Clarence's brothers, it wasn't Donald or Robert, had actually helped Betty out a little bit by saying there was no way that she could have done that murder 20 years after they had initially married. And again, the murder took place 18 years after the divorce. Plus, there were rumors that Clarence had bad blood with a motorcycle gang. Jibjab is really stepping it up with their Starring You books. You can create a book that is starring you, or you can create one for a friend or a family member as a gift that stars them. And just imagine your kids. Create one for your children, and they will love seeing themselves in a book. So click the link in the episode description and make a book today. Not long after Betty's divorce from Clarence, she married her second husband, John Flynn. He was 4 years her senior. They got married on February 9th, 1953. Betty's son Gary even took John's last name, so he became Gary Flynn instead of being Gary Malone. Betty and John then had Peggy, and they seemed like your normal all-American family. Everyone liked them. They were pretty peaceful people. But in 1955, John was shot dead on a New York pier. Betty initially told investigators that he had frozen to death in his truck in New York City. She later changed the statement and said that he was shot on the pier because of a 1950s mafia hit. At the time, investigators weren't able to determine a lot about his life or his death because, for one, it was the 1950s. So as a result, his death certificate doesn't really give a lot of information. But in the end, Betty just wasn't a suspect at that time. It was the suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of her other husbands after she was arrested in 2008 that resulted in this case being looked into again, just like Clarence's case. But after this one, what does Betty do? She moves on with her life. And in the 60s, she decided to enroll in beauty school. And that's when she met Richard Sills. This Navy man was head over heels for Betty. And it didn't take long for them to get married in 1956. But let's go to April 18th, 1967, when he and Betty get into an argument in their bedroom after they returned from the bar down the street to their apartment. And that's when Betty said he got a gun and this is after their argument or during, he got a gun and he shot himself in the side, which is a very odd place for someone who's suicidal to shoot themselves, because that can equal suffering, and a lot of folks that unalive themselves don't want to suffer. They just want it over with. So that kind of sounds weird that he shot himself in the side. But poor Peggy, she was in the next room and she heard the argument, and then she heard the gunshot or gunshots. And the same went for Gary. He heard all of this go down as well. So Gary and Peggy ran to the bedroom, and Peggy said Richard was lying on the bed and he was snorting. She said he rolled off the bed. The paramedics came and she asked if he was dead, and the paramedics simply told her, "Get out of here." She didn't remember much else. His death certificate said suicide, but later investigation showed that there might have actually been 2 gunshots instead of 1. His heart was hit and his liver appeared to be hit by a second bullet, but there was no autopsy performed to confirm any of this. But of course, authorities in 2008 looked deeper into this case and found that little tiny detail, that there might have been a second shot. In 2009, they wanted to exhume Sills' remains to aid in the investigation, but the time to pursue the case had expired. Florida law has a statute of limitations on potential manslaughter cases, so the case was closed. That was it. There was no more to do with that one. The son of Sills later went to the Naval Services Cold Case Squad about his father's murder, as he said, even though it was deemed a suicide. And based on his father's military file, it was said to be unlikely that Richard would commit suicide. The son believed Betty did it because of inconsistencies in her story. Unfortunately, the Navy agreed with the investigation conducted by the police, and nothing further was done. And his son just didn't know what to do. So he just couldn't take it any further. After Sills died, it didn't take her long to meet and marry Harold Gentry. It took them only 9 months from the time they met. And this is another guy that was head over heels in love with Betty because, as he put it, she was fun and feisty. A friend of Betty said that Betty had quite a mouth on her. Said even a sailor would blush at the way she spoke. She threw out the curse words, something crazy. But to Harold, that was a feisty girl. Gentry, he had been in the U.S. Army and was stationed in Florida. It was 21 years before he retired from the service, and as a result of that, he decided that he wanted to move back to his home state of North Carolina. And so they did. And they then had their daughter Kelly. Not long after they were married, Kelly said that she had a great childhood. So what I'm going to do now is go through the timeline of marriages, because so far you've received a whole lot of information, and I just want to make sure that we've got this list down pretty well at this point, because there's more to come. But to review this timeline, where I'm going to start with the first husband, Clarence, that she was married to from 1950 to 1952. He died in 1970 by gunshot to the back of the head. The second husband, James John Flynn, that she was married to from 1953 to his death in 1955, was shot dead on a pier in New York. Richard Sills, the third husband that she was married to from 1956 to his death in 1967, died from alleged suicide after an argument. Husband number 4, Thomas Harold Gentry, from 1968 to his death in 1986. He was killed by a hitman that she allegedly hired. He was shot multiple times in their North Carolina home. Then there's the fifth husband, John Neumar, that she was married to from 1991 until his death in 2007. It's said that he died by septic infection. There's actually more to it than that I'm going to tell you here shortly. It's more crazy stuff. But anyway, I want to expand on Harold Gentry's murder first, since it is the one that sparked all of these investigations into the deaths of the past husbands. But neighbors described Betty as the perfect neighbor. And they were really kind of living their best life for the longest time. But they were hit by some tragedy during this marriage, and it happened in 1985. So, as you remember, Betty had a son, Gary, with Clarence Malone, and Gary took on John Flynn, the second husband, took on his last name. So, Gary Flynn, who lived in Michigan but was working at a nuclear power plant in Ohio and had to take on an apartment to stay in while he worked and left his wife and children in Michigan, he ended up dying. It was during a welfare check to his apartment that he was found with gunshot wounds, and it was ruled a suicide. Cecilia, Gary's wife, especially his wife, thought that suicide was weird, and she described Betty as a not nice person, and Betty collected $10,000 in life insurance off the death of her son. She had had a life insurance policy on him, her very adult son. But at the time, Betty was a grandma that had her own beauty shop. She attended church. She raised money for charities. But Gary's stepson, Jeff, said that he saw an ugly side to Betty. He said that she would belittle, she would start fights, talking fist fights, and act one way in public, at church in particular, and another way behind closed doors. He said Gary wasn't great all the time, but he didn't think Gary would commit suicide. But when it happened, Cecilia rushed to the apartment because she wanted to get there before Betty did, because she knew there had to be money there in the apartment. And there, lo and behold, was a stash of $16,000 in cash, and there were firearms under the bed as well, with some ammunition. Betty and Harold arrived in Ohio after this, and Gary was cremated the following day, and Betty took home his ashes. Yeah. It just seems like, I don't know. But anyway, Jeff said in 1987, now remember, Jeff is Gary's stepson, and he said after Harold's death that he lived with Betty in Georgia after he was divorced. She got him fired from 2 jobs, meddled in his relationship with his girlfriend, and offered to take a $100,000 life insurance policy out on him. He said she scared me. So he returned to Michigan. He ran. He needed to get away from this woman. But going back to Harold, his murder alarmed the community. He was a beloved man. He had no enemies, but he was shot 6 times. It looked like he was ambushed. Forensic scientists said it looked like an ambush. Forensics showed that the shooter had to be in the sunken living room of the house. So when you came into the house, you had this little upper level here, but then there was a few steps that went down into like a sunken living room area. So the person that shot him had been standing down in that area and shot up at him. So they were able to determine that, which showed them that, hey, this might have been an ambush. The house, it was ransacked, but there was no sign of a breaking and entering at all. But Betty, now if you're wondering where Betty's at in all of this, she was out of town in Augusta, Georgia. She was over 3 hours away getting her truck fixed when a neighbor received a call from a concerned relative about Harold because he didn't show up for work on Monday. The neighbor decided to check on him because it was very strange. The neighbor went over to the home, to that single-story ranch-style brick home that Betty and Harold lived in. He noticed that the sliding glass doors were open. When he stepped inside, he saw Harold face down on the floor with his hands clutched to his chest and his pipe still in his mouth. Unbelievable. The police, EMS, and other authorities arrived, and of course it was quite evident that it was too late to try any kind of life-saving measures on Harold. And where Betty was out of town, she had this ironclad alibi. So it was very obvious that she wasn't the trigger person. She was 2 states away. She couldn't have been the trigger person. And one of Betty's daughters at this time had been away at college. And she saw her boyfriend's parents coming to her door, and she was afraid something had happened to her boyfriend. But instead, it was them to tell her that her dad had died. Betty had talked to them and asked them to go to her daughter and break the news. So another sister came and picked her up from college and drove her home to their parents' home. And when the girls walked in, they noticed a piece of the carpet had been cut from the rest of the carpet, and she immediately knew that's where her dad had died. She asked Betty, "What happened? What happened to my dad?" And Betty replied that the authorities suspected her of hiring someone. Like, right off the bat. She said, "They suspect me of hiring someone to kill your father." But her girls couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that that was possible. They'd had a good childhood. They had a normal childhood with their mother, for the most part. But here was a telltale sign. It's when Betty pulled up to the home, to this home of hers that had all of these flashing lights around it and had police officers in and out. She immediately just said to him, "I've been in Augusta." Before anyone said anything to her, she said, "I've been in Augusta." And she said it with absolutely no emotion whatsoever. And authorities noted this, that she had said this before anybody could ask her anything. And that is extremely suspicious. Very suspicious. But there wasn't a whole lot of movement on this case. So Betty goes on to sell the house, and she received the $20,000 life insurance policy that Harold had, and she also got his military benefits. So police say we have no suspect or motive. That caused the case to sit for a very long time. One investigator had said that he hoped that more information would come about as the case sat. He was just kind of giving it some time because he had some doubts about what happened because of the lack of a breaking and entering. He also said it didn't appear that anything had been stolen. But as for Betty's true character, which if investigators knew at the time the shady stuff of her past, they might have looked at her a little bit deeper. For instance, Betty told the Gentry family that she had previously been a nurse and that the first husband died of cancer. And we know that's not true. And I don't know, but she was engaged in these honest activities like working at a drugstore, waiting tables, driving a school bus. She had her beauty shop at one point. And Harold, he drove a delivery truck for Royal Chemical Company. He liked to fix clocks. They were pretty normal for the most part, and the daughters would agree with that. But over time, Betty became cold toward the Gentry family. She became cold toward Harold's brother Al. When the marriage became strained, Harold, he started living in a camper in the front yard. And Al, he had a lot of knowledge about that marriage. He said before Harold died, Harold had told him that Betty should never be trusted because she wasn't who she said she was. There was some information that came to light about Betty and Harold's marriage, and that was that they fought a lot. And it was believed that Harold was seeing another woman, so Betty told him to get out, and that's the reason why he was living in the camper in the front yard. And it wasn't long after she told him to get out that he was murdered. And Harold's brother Al, he put the pressure on the authorities nonstop to investigate, but again, the case just kept moving so slow. Because of how slow the investigation into Harold Gentry's death was going, that gave Betty time to marry John Neumar in 1991 when she was 60 years old, and they remained married for 16 years before he died. As for how John Neumar allegedly died, his cause of death was listed as ischemic colitis, sepsis, and ileus symptoms that could be from arsenic poisoning. Now, the official result was not arsenic poisoning. It's just that those things can be caused by arsenic poisoning. The circumstances were just very suspicious, especially since John Newman Jr. did not know about his father's death until he read about it in a newspaper. He then contacted Betty to ask her about his father's death, and she said he had already been cremated, which John Jr. thought was very strange because his father had previously purchased a burial plot, and that didn't sound like somebody that wanted to be cremated, nor did his dad ever tell him that he wanted to be cremated. John's relatives were also suspicious because they knew about Betty's background. But then John Jr. learned something very interesting, and that's that his father and Betty had filed for bankruptcy because of $200,000 in credit card debt. And I believe that the number of credit cards involved was somewhere around like 48. And at the same time, I mean, she's wanting more and more. The jewelry, the clothes, all the things. And she just wasn't ever satisfied. And that goes right along with what Robert Malone had said about Betty when she was married to his brother Clarence, was that she just wanted more and more out of him. And, you know, here we've got John Neumar, who's now died. He died in an Augusta VA hospital. And you've got, at the same time, Al Gentry pushing the authorities to reopen the investigation on his brother's death, because he had a feeling that Betty had something to do with it. So he really put on the pressure. They reopened it, and they saw reason to arrest her, which I believe was maybe approximately a year after John Neumar had died. So they go after her. They get her. She had no emotion, not a single tear. And one piece of information that they did have that helped them out was that there was a former police officer that came forward and said that she had tried to hire him months before the murder to kill Harold. The second witness was a neighbor who received the same offer. And further investigation showed that the shooting was more execution style because of the excessive number of shots, and no evidence of a robbery gone wrong was present. The robbery or the break-in or whatever looked staged, and there was no forced entry. But here we go. Neither of these guys pulled the trigger. They didn't do it, obviously. So that means there was a third person involved, and that's what made up her third count of solicitation to commit murder when she was arrested in 2008. And as we know, that third attempt was successful. And while investigating her past, authorities had learned at that time about all 5 of her marriages and that all 5 husbands were dead. They also found that Betty had 28 aliases throughout the years on passports and driver's licenses. So you're going to hear a clip here that a news station had aired, and you'll find it quite interesting. It mentions overseas bank accounts and that there may have been a pyramid scheme involved.
Came as an attorney for Betty Neumar, trying to get her out of jail. And WCNC reporter Mark Boone was in court for today's hearing. He brings us the new information tonight.
Betty Neumar has been here at the Stanley County Jail for several weeks, held on a $500,000 bond. And when her attorney asked today for that amount to be reduced, the prosecutor revealed some very strange things we did not know about the 76-year-old grandmother.
I quit being surprised a long time ago.
That's Al Gentry. He tells me he always suspected Betty Neumar had something to do with the 1986 murder of his brother. Harold Gentry was found gunned down inside his Stanley County home. Now his widow is in a jail-issued jumpsuit, accused of hiring a hitman 22 years ago.
Oh, man, that's the prettiest outfit she's ever had on in her life.
In a court hearing Monday, the prosecutor revealed Neumar has used as many as 28 different names. Investigators finding several different passports and credit cards with those aliases. Neumar's attorney says he has not seen that evidence, but he argues other defendants charged with similar crimes usually get a much lower bond.
Normal. $9.5 million.
No.
Charles Parnell lost his argument, so Neumar stays in jail for now.
I never thought they'd ever get her, because she is slick. She should be a lawyer. She's so darn slick.
We've also learned more about some overseas bank accounts allegedly in Betty Neumar's name. New at 6, what her attorney is saying about those accounts and their possible connection to a pyramid scheme. Reporting from our WCNC mobile newsroom in Albemarle, I'm Mark Boone.
And since Neumar's arrest, investigators have started re-examining her previous husband's deaths. The most recent, John Neumar, died in October in Georgia. Detectives have tested his remains for poison. Authorities are also looking at the death of her third husband. Richard Sill's death in 1965 was originally ruled a suicide. At the family's request, Ohio investigators are looking into the death of husband number 1, Clarence Malone. He died 20 years after they split up. Police don't think Neumar had anything to do with his death. And then just last week, family urged police to look into the 1985 death of her firstborn son, Gary Flint. It, too, was originally ruled a suicide.
So approximately 200 people came forward and said that Betty talked them into a get-rich-quick scheme. She told them that they would receive $100,000 for every $100 they invested toward the legal expenses of a rich European family that had died with no heirs. As word spread of this opportunity, people started bringing money to her beauty shop. John Neumar Jr., he even gave her $1,000 because he trusted her at that time. But when investors saw no money, she told them that the lawyers in Europe needed more time. In the end, 7 people were arrested in the scheme and pleaded guilty in 1997 to federal charges, but Betty was never charged. I know it seems like she got away with everything, because really she was. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that she had many faces. People had positive things to say about her. She was going to church. She was raising money. She was just the perfect neighbor, kind. But as in-laws would get to know her, she would change toward them. They said that she would get cold. It was a common thing with her when it came to her in-laws. She would start to show her true colors to them, and it worried them. But the community saw what Betty wanted them to see, and that was the nice woman, the good neighbor. And as she got older, authorities and many others looked at her and just thought she was a nice old lady. But the Toronto Star said it really well when they said that she was the woman with 2 faces. But the indictment against her said that she had sought out a former police officer and a neighbor to kill her husband. The plot began months before he was shot to death in their home. She told the potential hitmen that she would give them $20,000 out of Gentry's life insurance policy. But what I found was that the entirety of the policy was $20,000. So there was something else in it for her. Perhaps it was the selling the house, the military benefits, because she wasn't going to have anything left from the life insurance if she was going to pay a hitman. But that resulted in her, this thing that she did resulted in the 3 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. But she ended up posting a $300,000 bail bond after the judge had initially refused to lower it from $500,000. It was said that she was a flight risk, which her attorney argued she was not. But in the meantime, the ashes of John Neumar were taken into custody and tested for arsenic, but none was found. A doctor explained that there were metals present, but the results were inconclusive. That closed the case on John Neumar's potential arsenic poisoning. The family was not happy about this at all, because they were convinced that Betty had something to do with his death. And it was after this arrest, as I believe I mentioned earlier, that the North Carolina authorities had contacted the Medina County, Ohio Sheriff's Detective Scott Phillips about the 1986 shooting of Gentry, so that the Clarence Malone case could be looked at again. And that chain reaction, there it went. All of these murders being looked into. And because every single death showed some kind of sign that it was that it could be murder, like in the John Neumar instance, or that it simply was murder like everybody else. And that really makes me ask, like Sills, Was he really killed by the mob, or was that her, another murder for hire plot? But we won't know. It was in a 2009 BBC documentary called The Black Widow Granny, which is where she got the nickname, where the case was kind of dug into, and Betty, of course, maintained her innocence. This was the one interview that she did because she had largely stayed away from the media. Even her daughters, Kelly and Peggy, said that she was such a loving mother and grandmother that there was just no way she could have done the things that she was accused of. And Betty called the people that accused her nuts. She said that she had room for forgiveness, though, that if you're going to go to heaven, you have to forgive. She said, I can't control when somebody dies. That's God's work. Unfortunately, before Betty could even stand trial, she passed away of cancer. And so we will never know what the outcome of that case was going to be. We have an idea of what it was most likely going to be, but as far as knowing what happened to the other husbands, if it happened by her hand, she's the only one that knew it, and she took it to the grave. So that does it for this episode of the Basement Files. I'm going to have a special bonus episode on February 27th, 2025. It's going to be waiting on you Thursday morning, or that morning. So it's about the South Carolina inmate, 67-year-old Brad Sigmund, he's decided to be executed by firing squad on March the 7th, 2025. He was convicted of killing his ex-girlfriend's parents in 2002, and this will actually make him the very first inmate to die by firing squad in South Carolina, and the first in the country since 2010 when Ronnie Lee Gardner was put to death in Utah. On March the 2nd, I will be covering the case of Herb Ballmeister, who stashed bodies in his backyard and posed mannequins to look like they were all having a pool party. I figure that's going to be a very interesting one. But just remember, like, subscribe, share, tell your friends about this podcast. I love telling stories. I love having you listen to them. So until next time, be good and God bless.